Here's a thread that connects three very different stories today. What happens when private ambition races ahead of the shared systems the rest of us quietly depend on? The trust that props up a company, the dark sky above all of us, the safety of the food on your table. Someone's ambition is testing a system we assume will just hold. Let's start with the company that has become the face of the entire AI era, and the people quietly walking out its doors. OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT. Arguably the most famous company of this technological moment, is preparing for what could be one of the largest stock market debuts in history. Reports say it filed a confidential draft with regulators back in June, reportedly seeking a valuation around $852 billion, nearly $1 trillion. And in the weeks leading up to that potential IPO, something is happening that has investors talking. A striking number of its top executives are heading for the exit. Let me give you the roll call, because the volume is the story. Just this past week, OpenAI's Chief Revenue Officer, Denise Dresser, announced she's leaving after only about 8 months on the job. That came the same week that Brad Lightcap, a longtime executive and the company's former chief operating officer who'd been there since 2018, announced he's departing to start something new. Reporting from Axios and others notes that in roughly the same stretch, the company has also seen the departure of its head of safety, its head of ethics, and its chief futurist. Earlier this year, 3 senior executives reportedly left in a single day. So this isn't one goodbye, it's a pattern. Scary framing, the one that grabbed headlines, came from an AI startup founder named Kevin McCormick, who said, and I'm quoting, that executives leaving OpenAI ahead of its IPO is a huge red flag. The logic behind that reaction is intuitive. If a company is about to become spectacularly valuable, why would the insiders who'd cash in the most be sprinting for the door right before payday? When the people who know the most head for the exits, it's natural to wonder what they see that you don't. But here's where I want to do the thing this show exists to do: slow down and be more critical than the headline, in both directions. Because huge red flag is a compelling story, and it might be right, but there's a much more boring explanation that's probably closer to the truth, and honesty requires me to give it to you. Executives leave companies right before IPOs all the time. The biggest one is money mechanics. Before an IPO, executives have stock that's tied up in vesting schedules and lockup periods. The pre-listing window is often a natural, even optimal time to make a clean exit for personal reasons, before you're locked into staying. So, a wave of departures before an IPO can look ominous, while actually being routine. One analysis I read put it well: correlation is not motive. People leave before IPOs for reasons that have nothing to do with the company being secretly doomed. And there's an even more interesting, more specific point buried in this. And I think it's the one actually worth your attention. Notice which departures I listed: the head of safety, the head of ethics, the chief futurist. Now think about what an IPO does to a company's incentives. You face relentless pressure to ship products on a predictable schedule and grow revenue every quarter. And the entire job of a safety or ethics function is, sometimes, to introduce friction, to say, slow down, let's check this isn't ready. Those two things are in structural tension. A safety team whose whole purpose is to sometimes hit the brakes is at a built-in disadvantage inside a company that's being rebuilt around the demand to never stop accelerating. So the exodus of the safety and ethics leadership, specifically, might not be a random red flag. It might be a signal about what kind of company OpenAI is becoming as it turns into a public, profit-driven machine. That's the part I'd watch, far more than the CRO leaving. Now let me steelman the calm view too, because I don't want to fearmonger. If investors genuinely believed these exits signaled internal collapse, you'd expect real panic, and there isn't much. Prediction markets, according to 24/7 Wall Street, are barely reacting. They're mostly just betting the IPO slips to 2027, which reporting suggests may happen anyway due to market conditions and rising competition from rivals like Anthropic. And the underlying business is, by the numbers, booming. The company's finance chief told investors that its enterprise business has now overtaken its consumer business in revenue, faster than expected, on a reported run rate around $40 billion. So this is not a company falling apart. It's a company minting money, while its leadership bench reshuffles dramatically. So here's my take, and it's a two-parter. First, resist the dramatic headline. Executives flee. Red flag is probably overselling what, at the C-suite level, is often just IPO timing musical chairs. But second, and this is the part that isn't hype, pay close attention to who is leaving. When the people responsible for safety and ethics are disproportionately the ones heading out the door of the company, building the most powerful technology of our time, right as it transforms into a profit-maximizing public entity, that's not stock market gossip. That's a quiet signal about priorities. The question I'll leave you with: when a company gets this valuable this fast, what part of it gets sacrificed to keep the growth machine running, and is it the part we most needed them to keep? Now, from a company reaching for $1 trillion to a company reaching literally for the sun, threatening something that belongs to every single person who has ever looked up. There's a startup called Reflect Orbital, and its business idea is genuinely audacious. Put a fleet of giant mirrors into orbit, and use them to reflect sunlight down to specific spots on Earth after the sun has set. The pitch is that you could sell sunlight on demand. Beam light to a solar power farm so it keeps generating electricity into the evening, or illuminate a construction site or a disaster zone at night. On its face, it sounds almost magical, selling sunlight after dark, and I'll grant it a real hearing. There are genuine potential uses, and the ambition is the kind of wild swing that sometimes moves the world forward. But a new study, modeling what this constellation would actually do to the sky, just put hard numbers on the cost, and the numbers are alarming. According to the research, a single one of these satellites, 54 meters across, would appear 4 magnitudes brighter than the full moon to anyone standing in its beam. Let me translate 4 magnitudes, because that's astronomer speak. The magnitude scale is such that each step is a big multiplier, and 4 magnitudes brighter than the full moon means dramatically, blindingly brighter than the brightest thing in our night sky. And it's not just the person in the target spot. The study found the satellite's scattered glow would outshine natural moonlight across the sky from 14 kilometers away, and remain visible from over 30 kilometers out. So one mirror doesn't just light up its customer's field. It smears light across the sky for everyone in a huge radius around it. Now hold that image. And here's the part that turns a neat gadget into a genuine fight. The company's plans reportedly scale up to as many as 50,000 of these mirrors by the mid-2030s. 50,000 artificial bright objects, sweeping light across the night. And the pilot satellite has already been approved by the FCC, the U.S. communications regulator, despite objections from astronomers. So this is not hypothetical. The first one got a green light over the protests of the people who best understand what's at stake. And this is where I have to get critical, because this story is a near-perfect example of a pattern that should worry you far beyond astronomy. Think about what's actually happening. A private company has found a way to profit from a shared common resource, the night sky, and the cost of its profit gets paid by everyone else. The company captures the revenue from selling sunlight to a customer, but the price, a brightened, degraded night sky, is paid by every astronomer whose telescope gets ruined, every nocturnal animal whose migration and hunting depends on natural darkness, and every human being who has ever wanted to look up and see the stars. Economists have a term for this, a negative externality, a cost you create but push onto others. The night sky is one of the last true global commons. Nobody owns it, everybody shares it, and one company, with one regulator's approval, is in a position to degrade it for all of us. And notice the asymmetry, because it's the heart of why this is so troubling. To sell light to one construction site, you impose a brighter sky on millions of people who never agreed to it and get no benefit from it. The astronomers objected. They got overruled. And there's no real global body governing this. No one whose job is to represent the 8 billion people with a stake in the dark sky against the commercial interest of the few who'd light it up. The study's own framing captured it exactly. It's a fight over who controls the night sky, and who answers for what's lost when it disappears. Right now, the honest answer to who answers for it is no one. There's a company, a regulator that said yes, and a lot of overruled scientists. So my take, I'm not against ambitious space companies, and there may be narrow, genuinely useful applications for reflected light. But we found a way to make money from a resource that everyone shares, and we'll let everyone else absorb the damage, is one of the oldest and most destructive business models on Earth, and now it's going to orbit. The deep question this raises isn't really about mirrors. It's this: when something belongs to all of us and is owned by none of us, who gets to decide to change it forever? And why should that be a startup and a single regulator? Keep an eye on this one, because how we handle the night sky is a test run for how we'll handle every shared resource that private ambition learns to monetize. All right? From the vastness of the sky, let me bring it all the way down to your kitchen table, and to something that sounds mundane, but sits on exactly the same theme: the eggs in your refrigerator. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration just assigned its most severe classification, a Class 1 recall, to a recall of nearly 1.6 million cartons of eggs. Specifically, 1,589,577 cartons from a company called Midwest Poultry Services out of Indiana. Because the eggs have the potential to be contaminated with salmonella. And I want to use this to explain something genuinely useful. Because recall is a word we hear constantly and mostly tune out. And the details here actually matter for your safety. First, what Class 1 means, because it's the whole point. The FDA has tiers of recalls, and Class 1 is the most serious. Their own definition is stark. A Class 1 recall means there is a reasonable probability that using the product will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. That's not the packaging was mislabeled recall. Salmonella is a serious bacterial infection, and for the very young, the elderly, and people with weakened immune systems, it can be genuinely dangerous. So this is the tier that deserves your attention. Here are the specifics you can actually use. The eggs, both white eggs and brown cage-free eggs, were produced between June 6th and July 3rd, and carry sell-by or best-by dates between July 20th and August 17th of this year. They were produced in Texas, but shipped across the South and Southwest, to food service and retail outlets in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. So if you're in that region, this is worth 2 minutes to check your carton against the recall details. But here's the part I find genuinely important, and it connects this humble egg story to our other two: the timeline. The company first initiated this recall back in July, but the FDA only assigned the severe Class 1 classification this week. That's a gap of several weeks between "we're pulling these eggs" and the government has formally told you these could kill vulnerable people. Now, the FDA has a fair explanation for this, and I'll give it to them. They note that companies often start voluntary recalls and notify the public well before the FDA finishes its own classification process. In other words, the system is designed so the company can act fast on its own, and the official government stamp catches up later. That's actually reasonable. You want the company pulling suspect product immediately, not waiting weeks for a bureaucratic label. But here's the critical flip side, the thing worth sitting with. During that gap, those several weeks between the quiet July recall and this week's severe classification, how many people saw the news? A voluntary recall by a poultry company you've never heard of in July is not exactly front-page news. And those eggs had best-by dates stretching to August 17th, meaning they could very plausibly still be sitting in someone's refrigerator right now. So the system relies on a chain of communication that has real weak links. The company announces, but quietly, the news trickles out. The severe label comes weeks later. And the whole thing only works if the information actually reaches you, the person about to make an omelet, in time. The recall being issued is not the same as the recall reaching you. So my take on the eggs is the same lesson as the other two stories, just in your kitchen. We have a food safety system, and by global standards, it's a genuinely good one. The fact that we can trace 1.6 million cartons back to a single producer and a 3-week production window is actually impressive infrastructure. But a safety system is only as strong as its weakest link. And the weakest link is almost always the last one. Getting the information to the actual human being in time to act on it. The classification catching up weeks later is fine for the paperwork. It's not fine for the person who ate the eggs in the meantime. So the practical takeaway, don't rely on a recall finding you. If you're in those states, check your eggs. And more broadly, build the habit of occasionally checking the FDA and USDA recall lists yourself, because the system's last mile depends on you. So let me tie all three together, because the thread is the same one running under all of them. OpenAI, a company racing toward $1 trillion payday. And the question of whether the safety function gets left behind in the sprint. Reflect Orbital, a company racing to sell sunlight, and the shared night sky that everyone loses if it wins. And the eggs, a safety system that works on paper but depends in the end on the information actually reaching you. There's private ambition or institutional machinery moving fast, and a shared thing the rest of us depend on that can quietly get sacrificed in the rush. Trust, the sky, or your safety. So here's what I'll leave you with. When you see something new and ambitious and impressive this week, a giant IPO, a bold space venture, an efficient recall system, train yourself to ask the second question, the one the excitement skips over. Who bears the cost? What shared thing is being quietly spent to make this work? Because progress is real and ambition is good. But the bill for it almost never shows up on the same page as the headline. The most important part of any story is usually the part about who pays for it, and whether that's the same person getting the reward. Look for the cost. It's always there, and it's usually being carried by someone who never got asked. Take care of each other, and I'll see you next time.